The kind of innovation I talk about is not technological. That's why it's good to have us both here. I'm not a physicist, right? I'm a legal scholar and somebody who worked in politics for a little while. And from my vantage point, I think about innovation in terms of institutions. I think about legal and regulatory innovation. I think about governance systems and structures. And I think they have to be recreated at this moment for a 21st century energy challenge. We're working now with a 20th century regulatory governance structure. I'll speak about the US because it's what I know, but I'm sure that the themes I'm going to touch on about old systems adapted to an old understanding of energy, I'm sure those themes probably resonate here as well as in the US. But let me start with the picture of what's happening in the Trump administration. And by the way, please feel free to be informal, and perhaps this is breaking the rule, but I'm open to questions while I talk, if that's of interest to make it more interactive. Let me just give you an overview of what's happening. The Trump administration began with an important executive order from the president, which is basically kind of like a press release from the president, which lays out a policy agenda. And this particular executive order was about a new vision of energy dominance and energy independence and a shift away from the Obama agenda. And the executive order laid out, this is only a couple of months into the administration, laid out an agenda that would essentially undo, unravel, rescind, and in some instances replace with weaker rules every key component of the Obama administration's strategy on climate and clean energy. And it was aimed at the agencies of the federal government. Here there would be ministries. It was a directive, really, to look at each and every rule that had been put in place by the Obama folks and to undo them. And then a few months later, the administration ended the suspense, the international suspense, waiting to hear if the United States would actually announce a withdrawal from the Paris Accord. And of course, the president did announce a withdrawal. That process takes a few years. And I always like to point out that it actually won't be legally effective. That is, withdrawing won't be legally effective until the day after the next presidential election in the United States. So I find that heartening to share with people because things can change as administrations come and go. But that was announced in mid-year, in the first year of the administration. And then quite systematically and deliberately, they actually have gone about doing exactly what the president announced, which is to basically repeal all of the most important regulations on climate and clean energy. The New York Times put out a really terrific chart a little while ago, a couple of months ago, in which they summarized what the Trump administration was doing in terms of regulatory rollbacks. These are environmental standards across the board, not just to do with climate change and not just to do with energy, but across the board, clean water, clean air. But a very significant percentage of them have to do with climate-related regulations, drilling and infrastructure for energy-related regulations. And it totaled about 80. 80 major rules across the federal government is a lot of regulation to unravel. But the administration is in the process of doing that. And it's important to know that this is all being challenged legally, so that what we're in right now is a period of intense litigation. The story in the United States is a period of contestation through the courts over how much an administration can shift policy and whether the Trump administration has done it in a legally defensible way. But the story I'm telling you is a story of sort of at the federal level in the United States, federal retrenchment, kind of leaving the stage of leadership that had been occupied, as you're all familiar with, by the Obama administration. The other component of this sort of retreat and retrenchment is the positive part of the Trump agenda, in the sense of the embrace of fossil fuels, a re-embrace of fossil fuels, and an opening of public lands, including the outer continental shelf in the United States, to drilling to an unprecedented degree. And so what you're witnessing at the federal level is the exact reversal of everything the Obama administration had put in place, because they had constrained somewhat drilling on the outer continental shelf, constrained coal leasing on public lands, and been trying to move forward to site a lot of renewable energy on public lands during their tenure. But the headline on all of this, which you're all familiar with, which is the US has left the stage, I always like to complicate a little bit, and I did this over at the Oslo Energy Forum too, by suggesting there is a lot going on in the United States that is less visible. And it is operating at the subnational level. And if I had visuals, if we used PowerPoint at the Nobel Institute, I would show you some maps that would, if you're interested in climate and clean energy policy, cheer you up. Because it would show you that about 20 of the US states, individually, independently, have adopted GHG targets or limits. Many of them binding, not just goals, but binding. 29 states, nearly 30 states, that's a majority of American states, have adopted renewable portfolio standards to procure some percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. That's a significant number of American states. And about 6 states currently have ambitious wind procurement in place, coastal states in the Northeast. Several states have adopted energy efficiency programs and standards. A number of states have begun to incentivize nuclear because of its low carbon value by providing zero emission credits to add additional payments, revenue for nuclear energy. There is a proliferation of policies at the state and indeed at the municipal city level that is hard to track and hard to assess at the moment, but there's a lot of dynamism in the system, a lot of activity and policy generation in the system. And what I say about this whenever I talk about it is, it's one thing to try to measure how much all of that will really accomplish. If we could project how many emissions that was worth, it would be valuable. But I look at it for a different reason. I look at it as policy demonstration projects that are very important to show that, yes, you can have a cap and trade regime operating in the northeast of the United States among 11 states, and it doesn't destroy the economy, and it creates a lot of revenue to fund green technology. Yes, you can have a binding economy-wide cap and trade system in the state of California, which after all has a population that is the size of, the country of Canada. And you can have that demonstration project show you that it doesn't destroy the Californian economy, which is robust and thriving, and it's spinning off billions of dollars in investments, again, that go to green tech, but also go back to consumers, and go back in particular to low-income community in the state of California. These are all, demonstrations of possibilities in terms of policy innovation. And this is crucial in the United States because the normal thinking is, well, when states go about doing this, they become laboratories and experimenters in policy evolution. Eventually, this is the thinking, the dominant thinking in political science and in law and in governance, there will be a demand for uniformity at the federal level. Eventually, this will all bubble up, and industry will go to the federal government and say, look, we've got all of these policies all over the place. Could you please adopt a comprehensive piece of legislation to deal with renewable standards and to deal with greenhouse gas limits and put this together in a package and create uniformity and predictability instead of all of this policy heterogeneity across the country? We expected that after the George W. Bush administration. In other words, this is not new that the states, quite invisibly, I think, to the international community, it is not new that the states have been engaged in policy innovation in the climate and energy space. In fact, the renewable portfolio standards I talked about across 30 states were adopted from the 1990s through 2008. This didn't all just start happening in the Trump administration. So there's a long-standing commitment at the subnational level to try to stimulate new policy, greenhouse gas reductions, adaptation, clean energy, integration into the electricity grid of renewables, and all the rest. And the thinking was that this had begun in the 1990s through the 2000s of the George W. Bush administration. And when President Obama was elected, the hope was, the states don't have to lead the way anymore. A new president will help get a new piece of legislation passed in the Congress. And I want to take you back to only 10 years ago or so. It feels like a long time, but it isn't in the span of history. When the Obama administration came into power, the Democrats in the United States controlled both chambers of our Congress, which are both necessary to vote on new bills. And we could not succeed in getting a climate bill through the Congress when we had a Democrat in the White House, a Democratic control of both the House of Representatives that has to vote on a bill and the Senate. This is an important fact, that we could not get a climate and energy bill out of the Congress, even when the Democrats control. And what it tells you is energy challenges and climate change it doesn't fall out along party lines quite in the United States anyway. Because different parts of the country, different regions, different states have different natural resource endowments just like countries do. They have coal, or they have wind, or they have solar, or they have gas and oil and gas. And so where elected representatives vote depends on their resource endowment and how much they'll suffer in their state and regionally. And that's just a different breakdown than pure Democratic versus Republican. So we did not get that bill passed. And what that led to is a kind of default approach to dealing with climate and energy in that administration. What we did, and this was in part during my time there, we said, what are the laws on the books that we can use to address climate change if we don't have a new regulatory structure? If we use the existing regulatory structure. And we turned to the Clean Air Act, which is the clean air law in our country. And we sort of put in place the best policies available using the existing law. And the two pillars that I always talk about, because they're the foundational pillars for the pledge to the Paris Accord, they're the domestic policy foundation for what the US then promised in Paris. The US pledge was 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, or up to 28%, and that came from adopting two main policies. One was for the transport sector. The policy basically consisted of fuel efficiency standards and greenhouse gas standards for cars and trucks, and then into the heavy-duty trucks and all the way through the transport sector to airplanes and everything. And the Obama administration said we're going to double these standards by 2025. Very ambitious in the United States. They had been moribund for a very long time. In fact, we had fallen behind many parts of Europe, China, many other countries well ahead of us on fuel efficiency. So we said, we'll double them. And the auto industry actually supported this, and they supported it because they got uniformity, clarity, predictability, and a gradual ramp up. And that policy was seen as a major foundation for at least one of the sectors contributing about a third of the problem of climate change in the US economy. And transportation is a growing share, so we knew we had to do something about it. The second policy, and again, think of this is a sector-by-sector approach now using your existing clean air law because you don't have a new authority from Congress. So we then put in place what came to be known as the Clean Power Plan. It's the first national standards in the United States for power plants. For the old, dirty coal and gas-fired power plants, many of these old plants have been around for over 40 and sometimes over 50 years. Think of them as sort of chugging along with Band-Aids and toothpaste. And they have not been required to put pollution controls in because historically they were grandfathered into the existing clean air regime. So this policy was hugely important because for the first time ever, the United States would say the old dirty fleet has to meet some pollution control standards for greenhouse gases. That was a very ambitious policy and very controversial, and it wound up being challenged and litigated in the courts. And it consisted of this. Bear with me because the details matter so we understand now what has happened with the Trump administration. The Obama folks said, well, the power plants, we need to ask what the power plants can accomplish by reducing their emissions. What's a fair and reasonable standard? We can either just look at the power plant itself and say, how efficient is your boiler? And try to require improvements in efficiency. Or we can take a different approach and say it's appropriate to look at the entire grid as if it's an integrated networked machine and set standards based on what that grid can do if we use that grid wisely. And that means we have to think about substituting in renewables for coal, renewables for natural gas, and natural gas for coal. And if we think about the system, we can do a lot of that because grid managers know how to do that. And that allows us to set much more ambitious greenhouse gas standards for power plants because we're enabling the entire grid and we're imagining the entire grid as available, as a set of tools. What's happened to both those policies, and by the way, the prediction for that policy, projection was a 32% reduction in greenhouse gases over 2005 levels by 2030. And it was 17% below business as usual. So think of that 17% as the magic number. This is not going to solve the problem of climate change, but it's a good first step for the electricity sector. The Trump administration has taken those two policies, which again combined were the foundation for our pledge to Paris, and rescinded them, essentially. The fuel efficiency standards they announced, they would freeze them at 2020 levels, and I just want you to understand what that means. It means foregoing about the distance of fuel efficiency from 37 to 50 miles per gallon. It's a big distance, and freezing them in place. The Clean Power Plan, they basically rescinded the whole thing and said, oh, we don't look at the grid. We're not going to set standards based on what the grid can do. We're going to look at each individual power plant and ask them to make modest efficiency improvements, which amount to 1.5% at best under their own projections, greenhouse gas reductions. And in some calculations, emissions actually go up. This is from their clean power plant. This is from a pollution control strategy. It actually will produce more emissions because they're pairing it with a theory that allows power plants to run longer and not install controls. So they're allowed to update and modernize and not install controls. That means they'll run more of the year, and that means actually more total volume emissions. I give you all this detail because I want you to see the drama of the directional change, okay? And to understand that this amounts to a very significant regulatory rollback. So notwithstanding the tremendous activity in the states, we do have this other feature of the United States, which is happening at the federal level. And the other feature I want to point out, because it's not clear and visible to those from the outside, is that the Trump administration has done something else that could have very serious effects, actually, and in some sense, perhaps even more serious effects than just the rollbacks. Because think of it this way, in the United States, a new president can come in and reverse the reversal. All of these policies are interpretations of existing law. Presidents have the authority in the United States to direct their agencies to, reinterpret the existing law. And so there's flexibility to swing the pendulum back. So you could say, well, no big deal. At some point there'll be a different president, whether Republican or Democrat, who may actually want to approach these policies differently, and they will just bring back the old approach. But the thing that I always say is harder to reverse is what the administration has done on federalism. This is their approach to power. Federalism just refers to balance of power between the federal government and the states. And bear with me here, because this is quite dramatic, though subtle. They have adopted a view of state power versus federal power in which they have decided they will block the leading states from doing more. The leading states like California from doing more if they wish. And they will unleash or empower the laggard states that wish to do less. That is a total reversal of the bargain that was struck in the United States over environmental law. In the 1970s and even into the 1980s and even into the 1990s, signed by Republican presidents, negotiated by bipartisan Congresses in the US, there were a series of laws that all adopted this approach to environmental protection. And it is an approach that says we, the federal government, set the floor. The floor of clean air, the floor of clean water, in this instance it would be the floor of carbon regulation. And the states cannot fall below, but they can go above. So it's floor preemption without a ceiling. That's how we talk about it. The Trump administration has flipped it. They dropped out the floor, and the states can go as low as they wish, and they imposed a ceiling by freezing standards and lowering standards. So that is quite a different theory of how environmental protection and climate regulation should work, and I want to suggest to you that it's worth paying attention to how this plays out. The other thing I would mention is that the administration has opened public lands, as I suggested, to greater drilling and access, and so it's clearly pursuing a pro-fossil fuel agenda. So let me shift that. That is really the story of federal retrenchment and reversal, and then you have the story of state energy, state innovation, state policy making. And a lot of people think, well, here we go again. We're in a place where we're waiting for a new administration that is committed to action on climate change, and it will pick up where the Obama administration left off, and it will in some sense take over from the states. It will learn from the states, it will take over, and much of this will go into national policy in the United States. And what I want to suggest is something I suggested at the Oslo Energy Forum earlier today, which is I'm less optimistic that you will see either the carbon tax that Varun talked about, or a cap and trade bill, or actually any very significant legislation coming from the United States at the federal level, at federal policy on climate and energy. And I say that just because of the data, which shows us that Congress over time, the United States Congress, which generates policy, right, which passes laws, has become less and less productive over time. It is producing less legislation over time, not just in climate and energy, but across the board in many domains that require new rules, new laws to deal with new problems. Think about telecom, old telecom statutes trying to address new problems of the internet. We don't have a privacy law as you have in Europe. We are lacking in what I like to call the legal infrastructure for the modern moment. And so this is a problem, but it's a problem partly because Congress is producing less and less, and because there is greater partisanship over time between the parties in Congress. So we only have two parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans. There is a yawning and widening gap between the average conservative member of Congress and the average liberal member of Congress, such that if you were to plot it on a chart, you would just see it as if jaws were opening. And this is true in both the House, the one chamber of the House of Representatives, and the Senate. That recipe means it's very hard to pass laws, especially laws that require bipartisan support. And so I personally, just based on this trajectory, am not that optimistic that we can do any better getting a climate or a climate energy bill through the Congress than we did back in 2009 and 10 in the Obama administration. And what that leaves you with is a policy vortex in which the Congress is missing. Congress is inert. It's inactive in one of the most important policy domains of our time. And the action is between the president and the courts. Climate and energy policy is being set in the United States by the president and the courts. And the president does it by directing his agencies, or again, here they would be ministries, directing the agencies to interpret and implement laws along the lines of their policy preferences, and then the courts check him. That is not the optimal system for generating anything that can possibly address the scale and the scope of the challenge of what we call the energy transition and climate change. And if Congress remains in this moribund state, we will be continuing to build policy on these, what I call these rickety foundations of an old legal infrastructure, trying to fit climate policy into a clean air law that was not drafted to address climate change. Maybe it can be adapted to address climate change. We took that view in the Obama years, but it is less than optimal. What would be better is a fresh start. And it would incentivize the technology that Varun talked about. We would invest in R&D. Maybe we'd think about a national renewable portfolio standard, perhaps. We'd certainly put in place some greenhouse gas standards. Maybe there would be a carbon tax, maybe not. But it would be the policy, the sort of new suite of policies that we need for the scale and scope of this challenge. I'm not optimistic about that happening, and I think what you're going to continue to see coming from the United States, and don't miss it, is a lot of activity at the state subnational level that may amount to something. The states that have pledged, this is the America's Pledge led by Mike Bloomberg and Jerry Brown from California, that is a coalition of states, nonprofits, and private companies. The claim is that that coalition, which is all pledged, their slogan is, we're still in, that they continue to want to work toward the goals of the Paris Accord. They claim to represent over half the US population, over half the US economy, and 35% of the country's emissions. And that's not nothing. And they claim that if all the policies they are communally, collectively adopting actually get implemented, big question, but if, that they could achieve something like 24% below 2005 levels, which gets you in the ballpark of the US pledge. Again, I just don't have the information to know whether this can be delivered upon, and I think there are a lot of obstacles, but it's a signal of what parts of the United States are prepared to do and interested in doing. The other thing I want to do with you is talk a little bit about some ongoing tensions that I think are getting in the way of us addressing this problem in a serious way. And I kind of laid out a challenge at the Oslo Energy Forum in which I actually said to all of these senior execs from the oil and gas industry that they are not actually dealing with this problem strategically. That the oil and gas industry does not have a strategy for dealing with climate change. They talk about it now, it's front and center now, but they aren't thinking and acting strategically, and they need a strategy. And I say this because I'm in these circles, you know, I have this funny life, which I always try to describe as a kind of dissonant life, where I go from Harvard, the academic universe, where I run an energy and climate program and think about this from a sort of regulatory design perspective, and I was in the government for a little while, so I really worked on policy, and then I serve on the board of ConocoPhillips, the world's largest E&P company. And I go through these worlds, and people are having entirely different conversations. In the spaces I'm in, they're having totally different, separate conversations. The environmental regulation, the environmental mission, climate change, it has a vernacular and a vocabulary and a set of priorities all its own. It's about public health protection, environmental harm, it's about the future, it's about sustainability. And in the energy space, it's about economic growth, cheap, abundant, and reliable energy, and it's about now. And each of these two ways of thinking and ways of talking and in their own domains are missing something and have real blind spots. In the oil and gas space, and I told them this, their blind spot is that they really don't consider enough the impacts. The environmental and human impacts of energy, not just production, but consumption. And I said, they don't take responsibility. They act as if this isn't their problem, that it's somebody else's problem, but it's their problem. And it would be interesting to hear from them about what they want to do about this problem if they were to embrace it. And I said on the environmental side, in their conversation, they have blind spots too, and they tend to downplay the dependence we have on oil and gas, which we will have for some time, because the transition of the world's energy system does not happen overnight. And human society depends on oil and gas and will continue to, and to downplay it and pretend it's not true, I think it's not intellectually honest. And the other thing that the environmental conversation often downplays is the cost of transition, and the sunk costs, trillions and trillions of dollars in an energy infrastructure that needs to be replaced or added to. So my argument to them and to you is that what's getting in our way right now is that we cannot seem to integrate these two conversations and do these things at the same time. In the US, we've always pursued energy regulation and energy policy on one track and environmental policy on the other track. We do energy first, then we clean it up later with environmental policy. Can't do that in the 21st century. You have to figure out how to produce the affordable, reliable, secure, abundant energy through a diversity of sources in a way that is sustainable right from the get-go. And you have to be able to integrate these two lines of thinking and lines of regulating, and you need policies that can help us do that. So I want to argue for policy innovation for the 21st century and legal infrastructure for the 21st century that goes along with the new infrastructure that's physical and with the technology that Varun so well described that we need. And these things have to be paired together. And I see that as the challenge. I see it as doable. I'll say this. I don't think how to get there is a mystery, actually. I mean, we have a bunch of policy options for what governments can do at various levels. There are a bunch of levers to pull. You may like a tax, I don't so much, and we could talk about that in questions. I'm much more in favor of a sort of cap and trade system. I have my reasons for that. I don't think there's a lot of difference in the end. But politically, I think there's a difference. I think it's much harder to get a tax in the United States. We don't say that word. It's a European word that we do not say. But you can choose from among these policies. There's just a suite of them, and we've experimented with lots of these approaches, so it's not a mystery. And I think the technology isn't even a mystery anymore. It's going to be perhaps costly, it'll take some time, it requires some investment and some support, but I think the technology solutions are there, I think the policy solutions are there. There's a recent book that came out that talked about all of the legal solutions that are there, the legal authorities that can be used in the United States. So none of that is a mystery, and that gives me hope, because that means it's just a political problem. And that just means you have to have the right coalition. I don't think we have the coalition in the United States right now. I don't think you should look forward to a big brand new climate and energy bill that will revolutionize American policy in the next administration or perhaps even the next after. And this Green New Deal that's being talked about, as I said earlier today, don't mistake politics for policy. That has zero chance of getting adopted in any form that is recognizable. It's a hugely ambitious, as Varun described, it's unrealistic, but it's a politically important move that's being made to say, we want to do something big, so it's a signal, and it's a mobilizing policy to try to mobilize the youth and mobilize energy for the 2020 presidential election. But it will not be adopted, I promise you. So I really look forward to your questions. I hope I gave you a little bit of insight into the US at the moment, and maybe even some optimism, and I will leave it there. Thank you.